Okay, good evening. Welcome to this week's Parsha Shiur. Because it was a slightly longer halacha one, we will have a slightly shorter Parsha Shiur. Very interesting nonetheless. The primary focus of Parsha's Tetzave, this week's Seder, is of course the Big Day Kahuna, the clothes for the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol. I actually want to focus on the end of the Parsha because we now have a Mishkan, as described in last week's Seder. We now have people who can officiate with the proper clothes, as described in the beginning of this week's Seder, and then you have the induction of, if you like, the discussion of the Mishkan actively beginning. And the Pasuk describes various karbonos. And if you look at the first box, and if you're listening online, email me please at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. The Pasuk says in the Seder in Perek Chavtes, Pasuk Lamates, Es hakeves ho'echod ta'aseh b'boker, ve'es hakeves hasheni ta'aseh bein ha'arbaim. One carbon tamid you bring in the morning, and the carbon tamid you bring in the afternoon. That's the Shnei Tamidim, the famous two carbonas, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Now, you've got a very similar pasuk in Parshas Pinchas, but you know that you can play spot the difference. Let's read the pasuk and see if you can spot the difference. Es hakeves echad taseh b'boker, es hakeves hasheni taseh bein harbaim. Seemingly exactly the same, but I've actually helped you because on the sheet I've highlighted the difference. In this week's Sedra, it says es hakeves ha-echad, with an extra hey, and in Parshas Pinchas it says es hakeves echad, not ha-echad. So why the difference? So I saw in the writings, and I saw this originally from Rabbi Frand, but he quoted the Shemen HaTov. I've got the Shemen HaTov here, extracted on the sheet, the third box. The Shemen HaTov quotes the Brisker Rav, who makes a very interesting observation. Let's go through the Shemen HaTov. B'yeh ha-griz, he quotes the Griz, the Brisker Rav. Al ma shenema b'Parshaseinu, es hakeves ha'echad taseh b'boker v'es hakeves hasheni taseh bein harbaim, tekan hoisif hey hayadua. There's a hey hayadua at the beginning. It's not hakeves echad, it's hakeves ha'echad. Ma she'ein kein b'Parshas Pinchas k'shemedaber al tzmidim nema keves echad taseh b'boker. Why the difference? Ubierhu Zatzal, the Brisker Rav explains, tahaloi hakvosim eina ma'agvim zeh zeh. The general rule is that the Shnei Kvosim, the Shnei Tamidim, are not ma'akev each other. If you didn't have the morning offering for whatever reason, you can still offer up the afternoon offering. It's much the same as tefillin. If Rachman al-Islam, a person only has tefillin shel rosh, not tefillin shel yad, you still put on the tefillin shel rosh, because it's not ma'akev each other. Masha'en kein kan, but there is an exception. The exception is the Chanukas HaMizbeach, which is described in this week's Sedra. There, if you haven't got both, you can't do them. Mash'en kein kan, says the Shemen HaTov, B'Chanukas HaMizbeach, im lo yihikriv b'boker, ein yochel lahakriv shel bein harbaim. Why? Because this is the initiation. This is the Chanukas HaMizbeach. And when it comes to Chanukas anything, it needs to get off to a good start. Next paragraph, Pirashti kol hascholos koshes. Very geschmack. We know there's a rule, kol hascholos koshes. Beginnings are difficult. Don't give up too easily. New starts, new jobs, new schools, new everything are difficult. That's how it's normally understood. But he has a different take on it. Sometimes beginnings are going to be a bit more complicated. For example, when it comes to Chanukah, for example, which was also the rededication of the Beis HaMikdash, after years of misuse, it's going to sort of have an impact of how it's going to flow from there. So therefore, any Chanukas of anything needs to be perfect. And therefore, they didn't want to use Shemen Tomei after Tumas Hudra B'Tzibur. The whole concept of Chanukah is they wanted to find Shemen Tahor. And therefore the one pot lasted for 8 days until they found new Tahor Shemen, but they didn't need that. Because really the halacha is Tum Hutra B'Tzibur, which means Tomei Shemen could have been used. Mishum D'chinuch tzarech liyos ba'ofen nehedar. When it comes to initiating something, it needs to be done in a very beautiful way. Kadei sheyishoy al acha etziosem mikudash. That it will perpetuate, it will have a longevity with that. Now, and therefore, says the Brisker Rav, as quoted by the Shemen HaTov, that's why it says in this week's Sedra, hakeves ha'echad, that they're ma'akev each other. If you haven't got one in the morning, you cannot offer up the afternoon one. You need both because it's a new start. It's Chanukas HaMizbech, and it's got to be done properly. Masha'enkin in Parshas Pinchas, if you didn't have the morning one, okay, so you offer up the afternoon one, and therefore it just says it's Hakeves Echad Taseh B'Boker, it's Hakeves Hasheni Taseh Bein Arba'im. Very beautiful. Now, that concept, I think, connects in two ways to last week's Parsha. How so? There's a very beautiful idea of Rabbi Shapiro. Rabbi Shapiro, the girls' school just came back from Poland. They were there last Shabbos, Wednesday to Sunday. Mr. Shem, we're going in a few weeks' time after Pesach, and one of the stops is going to the Yeshiva of Chachmei Lublin. And it's interesting because the following idea, which I'm going to share with you, is very apt for the person who says Rabbi Shapiro, the person who has, what a legacy, Daf Yomi, innovating Daf Yomi, and innovating the standards for yeshivas. I think that part is sometimes overlooked. He set the tone. What is normal in yeshivas today to have a chada ochel, the dining room, dormitories, the shir rooms, and the main Beis Medrash, he innovated that largely. There's no more living in local balabatim, esenteg, and impoverished. It's a different world. And this concept, which I'm about to share, is very matim for him, and moreover, it fits in very beautifully to the idea we've just shared about the keves va'echad. So he quotes a mechilta. The pasuk at last week's Seder talks about the kruvim on top of the aron. So the pasuk describes them as Elohei kesef, Elohei zahav. Why does it say both? Lefishehu omer v'osisa shnayim kruvim zahav. You should make two cherubs, two angelic, childlike figures on top of the Aron HaKodesh, one on each side. But if a person says, hey, I'm going to make four, the Torah says two, but I'm going to make four. It's as if you've got golden gods, which is going to be totally inappropriate for the Kodesh Kedoshim, and therefore, if you do more than two, that's idolatry. And then it says Eloi Kesef, Lomonem. Why does it say that? We're told it says Eloi Hezov. Ma Talmud Lom Eloi Kesef, Lefi Shemot Sinu says the Mechilta, Kol Klei Beis Halomim Shem Ein Lohem Shel Zohov, Hein Oisin Oisei Shel Kesef. Fascinating thing. What if your kalim broke, or you need to make new kalim? There isn't enough money. So can you make a menorah not out of gold? The answer is yes. A menorah, and there were times in Jewish history where it was made out of different material, less precious metals. And then when you could afford it, you make it out of gold. And so to all the kalim, with one exception, the kruvim. Shemea af ani sheshnaim kruvin kain. If you can't afford gold, you make it out of silver. Talmud lo me'eloi kesef mishenisa mishazov. If you do not make it out of gold, harihen ke'eloi kesef. They're like silver gods in the Beis Hamikdash. We don't want that. And therefore, the Mechilta is telling us, two and not four, gold and no other material. Says Rabbi Shapiro, why? Why is it when it comes to the kruvim, they particularly have to be made out of gold and not the other kalim? Says Rabbi Shapiro beautifully, because the kruvim, which are, like I said, angelic, childlike creatures, on top of the Aron HaKodesh represent chinuch, on top of the Torah, the Aron. And when it comes to chinuch, there is only a gold standard. There are no second bests. It has to be good, because our children are our greatest commodity. And therefore, there has to be one standard, and that's the gold standard. Because chinuch, by its very nature, is, well, what is chinuch? Chinuch is setting this child up for him or her to function and fulfill his or her potential. It's like an initiation. You're being mechanech them for life. It's the same word. Rabbi Malcolm Herman, in his wonderful book on parenting, makes this very point. Why is the Chanukas HaMishkan or Chanukas HaBayis a housewarming? Or chinuch, why is it all related? The answer is because each one, you're getting that thing ready for its designated purpose. A Chanukas HaMishkan means you're getting it ready for its function. A Chanukas HaBayis means my house is ready to live in. Chinuch is getting the child ready for its designated purpose in life. And therefore, when it comes to chinuch, there is one standard and a gold standard, which is really like the keves va'echad in this week's parsha. The beginnings have to be very, very strong. And therefore, if you haven't got the morning one, you can't offer up the afternoon one. It's got to be both. They're ma'akiv. another connection to last week's Parsha. The first pasuk of last week's Parsha says, Dabel b'nei Yisrael v'yichuli truma me'ez kodesh shedvenu liboy, tikhu es trumosin. And the first Rashi in last week's Parsha says, Om Rabbi Seinu is the bottom box, Sholosh trumas amuras kan. It says truma 3 times. Why? In that pasuk. Achas truma bekal al gulgei l'shinasu mehem adonim. One, there was a collection for the adonim, which were the sockets, where the boards of the Mishkan would be inserted into. So they were the receptacles of the boards. That's what the adonim were, the sockets. And one is for the mizbeach, bekala gugoles, liknos ben karbonos sibur, the way you would buy karbonos sibur, animals for the karbonos. And the third one, achas trumas hamishkan nidvas kol echod ve'echod, the general collection. So everyone asks, so why do you need 3 separate collections? One for the adonim, one for the karbonos sibur, one for the general, for the Beis Hamikdash. So I can understand 2 or 3. They're slightly different focus. One is for the general creation of the Mishkan, and the karbonos sibur, fine. But why do you need a separate collection for the adonim? Why can't they just use the money from the general collection? The answer is exactly what we've been saying. The adonim are the foundations of the whole edifice. And the foundations of the entire structure are critical to the future success of that structure. You get the foundations right, everything else follows. The moshel, and there are lots of sources. We'll go through a couple of sources, but the moshel. Well, let's go to the first source. Elisha ben Avuya, the Gemara calls him Acher. He sadly went off. He had a sad ending. So the Yerushalmi in Chagiga, at the top of the next page, tells us what the origins of his downfall was. So the Yerushalmi says, at the top of the next page, quotes a pasuk in Koheles. This is Yerushalmi in Chagiga Perek Beis Halacha Aleph. The pasuk says in Koheles, Tov achar isdava merishisai. Now, normally that is understood to mean Tov achar isdava merishisai. The end of a matter is better than the beginning. In other words, many people start a project but don't finish it off. Many people have started Daf Yomi but they don't quite finish it. Tov achar isdava merishisai. It's good to finish it off better than the beginning. That's the normal understanding of the pasuk. But the Yerushalmi learns differently. Tov achar isdava merishisai means the success of the end of this project depends on the beginning. Tov acharis dava meirei shisei, all depends on the beginning. And look what he gives an example. Beizman shel tov meirei shisei. When it's good at the beginning, it will have a happy ending. Ubi hoya hamaisa. Says Acher, Elisha ben Avuya, I can prove it to you from my own life experience. Because Avuya Abba Migdal Yerushalayim. My father Avuya, says Acher, was one of the greats of Yerushalayim. On the day for my bris, says Acher, he invited all the greats of Jerusalem. They were all invited, and Rabbi Shiur and Rabbi Elazar were sitting in a certain area. And they were learning. What they're going to, the two of them are sitting and they're learning together. And the power of that Torah was so intense that it brought fire down from heaven. And it surrounded them. Look at this. Look what Torah can do. It creates this miracle. Ma bosim this Rabbi Spacey. He said, I went over to him, hey, why are you going to try and you're burning my house down? We're just learning. But the power and intensity of their learning generated this fire. And Avuya was so impressed. Avuya, Abba, my father, Avuya said, Rabbi Sai, if that is the power of Torah, if my son becomes I'm dedicating my son's life, Elisha ben Avuya, to Torah. But since the father's kavanah was not l'shem shemayim, and therefore that person, he didn't have a happy ending because the initial declaration of the father was not so altruistic. He was inspired by the sort of the show of the whole episode, the lights and the sounds and the flashes and the fire, and therefore that wasn't the same Shema. I once heard Rabbi Shimon Weingarten, the former Rav of the Beis Medrash, quote this Yerushalmi once at a bris, and he said, if a father says this nowadays, I think it'll be okay. Yeah, halavai, right? But the point is, since the initial declaration was not so altruistic, it wasn't the Shem Shemaim, it was just really because he was so inspired by the power and the fancy, the appearance of fire. So therefore, it had some sort of impact. You have another example of it. The famous example of Rabbi Chia. The Gemara in Bava Metzia says that Rabbi Chia he said that he did something that Torah would be forgotten for Klal Yisrael. What happened? Because there was some sort of issue with the transmission process, and therefore he had to do something. He had to reteach Torah to make sure the transmission process was continuing. So Maya Vidna, so he says, what did Rabbi do? Al Zilna v'Shadina Kitna, I went and planted flax, for Gardilna Nishpi, and with the flax, I reaped the flax, and I made nets with it, for Ta'idna Tavi, and I hunted and I caught some deer, Umachina B'Israel Yosmin, I gave the flesh, the meat of the deer to Yosoimim, to orphans, V'Arichna Megilta, and then I flayed the animal, I took the skin, I made cloth, I made parchment, for Kasavna Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and then I wrote the whole of Torah down, V'Salikna Lamata, and I taught 5 students, etc., and they went down, etc., etc. And I therefore did this, and I ensured that Torah wouldn't be forgotten from Klal Yisrael. How great are the actions of Chia? Asked the Vilna Gaon on this Gemara, why did he have to go to so much effort? Just go to the local paper store and buy some parchment. Why did he have to go and plant flax, to harvest the flax, to then make a net, to trap the deer, to shech the deer, to chadgadia, and to make the cloth? Why? Teretz says the Vilna Gaon, because this was a new project. He had to teach Torah anew, as it were, and therefore the foundations had to be on the loftiest, purest levels, because initiations, beginnings are critical, and that is also explains Aseret Semei Tshuva. The Kitzur says here, the last box, in the Aseret Semei Tshuva, the first 10 days of the year, a person should be noiheg b'chumrus she'einu noiheg bohem kol hashana. He should be extra careful in these 10 days more than the rest of the year. Etc. And he gives the example of paspalta, etc., etc. It always strikes a person as a little bit two-faced. Motzi, a person, let's say, for example, is going to have Chol of Yisrael throughout the Aseret Semei Tshuva, and he'll have Chol of Akum, which is Mutzah, it's kosher, what to rely on, etc., etc. So, Erev Yom Kippur is going, he knows Motzi Yom Kippur, he's going to be eating Chol of Akum. So isn't that a little bit hypocritical? So what's that about? The mashal given is, imagine you have a skyscraper. So, after many years of building it, you get the surveyors in, and the structural surveyors come along and they've got to pass the building, they've got to give the certificates that it's all good. And they walk around the building, they spend a few days checking every nook and cranny of the building, and they come back with a report and they say, look, we've got some cracks in the building. So you say, is that a problem? So it depends where the cracks are. If the crack's on the 79th floor, that's actually okay normally. If it's a small crack, that's quite common. But if the cracks are in the foundations or in the very early floors, then it's going to fester to much bigger cracks. So it depends where the cracks are. The foundations are the ikka. And therefore, the Aseret Semei Tshuva, it's sort of doing surgery in utero, because the import is so much greater. And therefore, a person sets the tone for the rest of the year. If you get the Aseret Semei Tshuva right, that sets the tone for the rest of the year. Rabbi was beginning a new project. He had to make sure it was done on the loftiest of intentions. He was involved in every aspect of the process. With Avuya as well, there was a little fault in the outset of his life, and that manifested in a very negative way as life continued. And that's why we needed a separate collection for the Adonim in last week's Sedra, because that was the foundation of the whole edifice, and that would determine the future success of the Mishkan. And that is also why Meir Shapiro says that the kruvim has to be made of gold, because with other things you can use alternative materials if you can't afford the gold or you can't get the gold. But when it comes to the kruvim, they have to be made out of gold, because when it comes to chinuch, the initiation, getting a child ready for his designated purpose in life, that has to be the gold standard. And that really is the connection to this week's Sedra. That this was the initiation of the Mishkan. And therefore, one of the kvasim will ma'akev the other. If you didn't have both, then you can't begin the process. The process on the outset has to be done to perfection to make sure the longevity and the success of the continuity would be very strong. Okay.